Get out now. People like you don't belong here. Don't touch that car. You can't even afford the wheels." Those were the words that thundered across the marble floor of a luxury car dealership in Beverly Hills. Words so sharp and humiliating they cut through the air like glass shattering, leaving the entire showroom silent. Imagine the sting of being told in public that your presence is unwanted, your worth dismissed in an instant, your dignity ripped away before strangers. That moment was so outrageous, so blatant, that customers froze, salesmen paused mid-sentence, and all eyes locked on the man being shamed. Before I tell you what happened next, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Hit like if you believe no one deserves this. And subscribe so you never miss a story where justice wins. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because this was not just any man. This was Marcus Carter, 45 years old, founder and chief executive officer of Carter Automotive Group, a company that had grown into a multi-billion-dollar empire with 15 luxury dealerships stretching from New York to California. Marcus was not born into privilege, not raised in mansions or polished country clubs, but in Detroit, son of a factory worker and a school teacher. And from the time he was a boy, he carried a memory like a scar. He remembered standing beside his father at a used car lot, asking to look at a truck, only to be told by a sneering salesman that they were wasting his time, that people like them never paid on time, that they should leave the lot. That day burned into Marcus like fire, and he promised himself no customer of his would ever feel that sting, that humiliation. He built Carter Automotive Group on 3 values: respect, dignity, fairness. And for years, those values were untouchable. But then the complaints began to reach his desk. Quiet at first, subtle, then louder, more consistent. And they all pointed to one place: his brand new crown jewel on Rodeo Drive, Crown Motors Los Angeles, opened barely 1 month, already gleaming with Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, Bentleys displayed under chandeliers, already drawing Hollywood celebrities and tech millionaires, but also already drawing whispers of something ugly. A young woman said she was told the cheapest car was $40,000 and she should try the used lot down the street. A man in a suit but with dark skin said he waited 20 minutes without being acknowledged, while white customers arriving after him were welcomed instantly with coffee and smiles. Another wrote that he was asked for bank statements before being allowed to sit inside a Bentley. These were not mistakes, not coincidences. They were patterns. And Marcus knew patterns meant culture, and culture came from leadership. He could not ignore it, could not smooth it over with public relations or training seminars, because if it was true, then his own name was being used to humiliate the very people he had sworn to uplift. He decided he would see it for himself, feel it, test it, and the only way was to go undercover, not as the CEO, not as the billionaire, but as an ordinary man who looked like he might be stretching to dream of a nicer car. That night, in his Bel Air home, Marcus stood in front of a wardrobe filled with Armani suits and silk ties, but he pushed them aside, reaching instead for clothes he had not worn in years. A wrinkled shirt, faded khaki pants, scuffed brown shoes. He looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. Gone was the polished executive who commanded boardrooms. In his place was a man who could be mistaken for a middle-class worker, modest, forgettable, to seal the disguise. He walked past his Bentley Continental, past his Tesla Plaid, past the chauffeured Maybach waiting in the garage, and took the keys to a silver Toyota Camry 2010 with more than 100,000 miles. That car was perfect, because in Beverly Hills, pulling into a showroom in a car like that was like wearing a sign that said you do not belong. Marcus would not go alone. Sitting beside him was 19-year-old Malik Johnson, the son of a late friend, a college freshman Marcus had taken under his wing, treating him like family. Malik was nervous, tugging at his backpack strap, asking if this was really necessary. Marcus kept his eyes on the road. "I need to know," he said, calm, steady. And if they treat me like this, imagine what they do to someone your age. Malik nodded, still uneasy, but he understood. As they drove into Beverly Hills, Marcus's mind replayed the complaints. One letter haunted him, from a single mother who said she had walked into Crown Motors hopeful, only to be laughed at when she asked about financing, told by a salesman she should stick to cheaper brands, leaving the showroom in tears. That letter had cut deep, because Marcus remembered his own mother, strong but struggling, saving every penny, and he thought if she had ever been humiliated like that, it would have broken her. His jaw tightened, his grip on the steering wheel firm. This was not just about business anymore. It was about principle, about the soul of his company. The Camry rolled onto Rodeo Drive, past storefronts that gleamed like jewels, and into the lot of Crown Motors. The glass doors slid open, and inside was a palace of wealth, polished marble, chandeliers, cars shining like art. 3 salesmen hovered around 2 wealthy white customers, laughing, pouring coffee, handing keys for test drives. Marcus and Malik stepped in, stood quietly by the entrance. 1 minute passed, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. No greeting, no smile, no, "Welcome to Crown Motors." Eyes flicked toward them, then away. Marcus stayed still, his face calm. But inside he felt that old sting, the one from Detroit, the one he thought he had buried. Finally. He walked to the reception desk. A young blonde woman tapped on her computer, then glanced up with a look of disdain. "If you're here about a job," she said flatly, "applications are online." Malik blinked, his mouth open, but Marcus's voice stayed even. "I'd like to see your sedans," he said. Her eyes scanned his shirt, his shoes, the Camry key in his hand. She leaned back, lips curling. "Honey, our cheapest car is $40,000. Maybe try the used lot down the street." Malik's face flushed, anger rising, but Marcus placed a calming hand on his arm. He had come here for the truth, and the truth was already spilling out, word by word, look by look, dismissing him not as a customer, not even as a person, but as someone unworthy. The test had only just begun, and already his worst fears were being confirmed. Marcus had barely finished calming Malik when the atmosphere in the showroom shifted. And that was when Gregory Harlan, the 39-year-old manager of Crown Motors Los Angeles, made his entrance, his shoes clicking against the marble floor like a drumbeat announcing arrogance, his slicked back hair gleaming under the chandeliers, and his eyes narrowing the moment they landed on Marcus and Malik. Because to Greg, they were not customers. They were intruders. He walked over slowly, wearing a smile that was anything but friendly, a smile that told you he thought he was smarter, richer, and better than the person he was speaking to. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Greg said, his tone dripping with condescension, as though Marcus and Malik had stumbled into the wrong building. He did not say welcome. He did not ask what they were looking for. He did not even introduce himself. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, invading Marcus's space, and lowered his voice just enough so only a few could hear. "This dealership caters to serious buyers with serious money. Maybe you'd be more comfortable elsewhere." Malik shifted uncomfortably, his fists curling. But Marcus remained still, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on Greg. "I asked to see your sedans," Marcus repeated calmly, his voice measured, steady, refusing to be rattled. But before Greg could reply, another voice cut through, sharp and dismissive. It was Chad Miller, a 34-year-old salesman who had been hovering nearby, watching the scene with amusement. Chad was the type who prided himself on closing deals with wealthy clients, the kind who thought commission checks gave him the right to judge strangers, and he stepped forward with a smirk. "Don't waste his time." "Greg," Chad said loudly, glancing at the other customers as if to put on a show. "They can't afford to even look at these cars." Don't let them touch a Bentley unless they show you 3 bank statements first." The words hung in the air like poison, and a few customers chuckled nervously, not sure whether to be entertained or appalled. Malik's face turned red with humiliation, his chest rising and falling quickly, and he whispered under his breath, "We should leave." But Marcus lifted his hand slightly, signaling him to stay quiet. Marcus walked slowly toward a black Bentley flying spur on display, its sleek frame gleaming under the lights, and placed his hand gently on the door handle. He wanted to see just how far this game would go. Chad's eyes widened in mock alarm, and he raised his voice for everyone to hear. "Sir, step away from that vehicle. That car costs $230,000. Unless you've got proof you can pay, you have no business near it." The cruelty in his tone was deliberate, meant to humiliate, meant to remind Marcus of his supposed place. Greg folded his arms, nodding as if Chad's words were common sense, not an insult. Marcus straightened, his eyes calm, and asked, "Is that your policy for all customers, or just for me?" The question cut through, sharp and undeniable. But Greg laughed, brushing it off. "We use discretion," he said, his voice dripping with superiority. "Some people you can tell are serious. Some you can tell are just wasting time." At that moment, the glass doors slid open and a new customer entered. A tall white man in his 50s wearing a tailored blue suit, polished shoes, and a gold watch. His name was Thomas Reed, an oil executive from Texas, and the transformation in the staff was instant. Jessica, the receptionist, leapt to her feet with a wide smile. "Welcome to Crown Motors, sir. How can we help you today?" she chimed, her voice warm and eager. One of the salesmen rushed forward with a tray of coffee, offering him a seat in the VIP lounge within seconds. Thomas was being ushered toward a Rolls-Royce with keys in hand, encouraged to sit inside, start the engine, and take a test drive. No questions asked, no proof demanded. Marcus and Malik stood just feet away, watching the double standard unfold in real time. The same staff who had sneered at them now practically falling over themselves to please another man. "Based on nothing more than his appearance," Malik whispered. "This is insane," his voice shaking with both anger and disbelief. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He was letting them bury themselves. Then came the final straw. Brian O'Connor, the 40-year-old security guard, a tall man with broad shoulders and a permanent scowl, approached at Greg's signal. His hand rested on his radio, his stance aggressive, like he was dealing with criminals, not customers. "Is there a problem here?" Brian asked, though his tone made it clear he had already decided the answer. Greg gestured toward Marcus and Malik. "Yes, these gentlemen were just leaving." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "I said I wanted to look at a sedan," he repeated calmly. Greg leaned in close, lowering his voice but loud enough for Malik and Brian to hear. "You're making my other customers uncomfortable. This isn't the place for you." Brian stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Marcus's shoulder, his grip firm, almost shoving him toward the door. "Time to go," Brian said coldly. "Don't make me call the police." The humiliation was complete, public, deliberate. Customers turned their heads, whispering, some pretending not to notice, others staring openly at the scene. Malik tried to push Brian's hand away, shouting, "You can't treat him like this!" But Greg barked, "Control yourself, kid, or you'll be thrown out too," Chad added with a smirk. "Better listen to the boss. You don't want trouble." For a moment, the air was thick with tension. Malik's fists clenched, Brian's hand still heavy on Marcus. Greg's face red with anger, Chad smirking like a man who thought he had already won. But then Marcus spoke, and his words cut through the noise like a blade. His voice was calm, quiet, but laced with steel. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." The room fell silent. Not because they understood, but because the authority in his tone was undeniable. Greg scoffed, trying to shake it off. "Save the drama, sir. Leave before we have to drag you out." Chad chuckled under his breath. Brian's hand tightened slightly, and Malik looked at Marcus with wide eyes, sensing something powerful behind those words. Marcus allowed Brian to release him, straightened his shirt, and walked slowly toward the door. Every step was steady, measured, controlled. He stopped at the threshold, turned his head just enough for his words to carry across the room, and said, "You'll see me again very soon." Then he walked out into the California sun, leaving behind a showroom that thought it had rid itself of an unworthy visitor, not realizing it had just set the stage for its own destruction. Out in the parking lot, Marcus sat quietly in his Camry, his hands trembling not from fear, but from fury, a fury so sharp and controlled it felt almost cold. Malik slammed the passenger door, his voice breaking. "How could they do that to you? To us? It's disgusting." Marcus nodded slowly. Pulling out his phone, he dialed a number, his voice calm but deadly precise when it was answered. "Angela, it's me. They failed. Prepare Protocol 11. And with those words, the storm was set in motion, a storm that would sweep through Crown Motors, tearing down arrogance, exposing prejudice, and leaving careers in ruins. 30 minutes later, the same glass doors of Crown Motors slid open again. But this time, every step that echoed on the marble floors carried a different weight. And when the staff turned their heads, they saw a man who looked nothing like the one they had humiliated earlier. Marcus Hale had returned, no longer in his faded jeans and plain jacket, but in a tailored navy suit that framed his tall frame with authority, his polished black shoes clicking like hammers against stone, and a gold watch glinting on his wrist, the quiet sign of a man accustomed to boardrooms and contracts worth billions, not just cars. Jessica, the receptionist who had rolled her eyes before, froze in place with her mouth slightly open, as if she could not reconcile that the man standing before her was the same one she had dismissed an hour ago. Greg Harlan straightened his tie, pretending confidence, but the sudden stiffness in his body betrayed him, and Chad Miller leaned against a desk smirking, still convinced this was some stunt, while Brian O'Connor adjusted his belt near the security desk, watching with suspicion, his hand unconsciously hovering close to his radio. Marcus walked in without a word at first, his presence alone commanding silence, and then in a voice that carried across the entire showroom, he said calmly, "I want to see the district manager, now." The tone was not a request, it was an order, and the authority in it made customers look up from their cappuccinos in the lounge and whisper to each other. Greg forced a laugh, trying to regain the upper hand. "Sir, I already explained. This isn't the place for you." But his voice cracked slightly, and for the first time Chad's smirk faltered. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes locked on Greg, and in a voice low enough for only those nearby to hear, he said, "Tell him Marcus Hale is here." The color drained from Greg's face, the name echoing in his mind. Faint recognition dawning as if he had read it before in an email or seen it on a contract, but his arrogance would not let him accept it. He barked, "Enough of this nonsense. I don't know who you think you are, but you don't give orders in my dealership," before Marcus could respond. The glass doors burst open again, and in rushed Samuel Price, the district manager, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning, his suit wrinkled from running, his breath short, and the urgency in his eyes enough to confirm that this was no ordinary visitor. The moment Samuel spotted Marcus, his face went pale, his jaw tightened, and he hurried across the showroom floor like a soldier reporting to a general. Customers turned in their seats, employees straightened nervously, and the entire energy shifted from arrogance to dread. "Mr. Hale," Samuel said breathlessly, his voice trembling with both respect and fear. I had no idea you were here." The words struck like thunder, and a ripple of realization passed through the staff. Jessica gasped audibly. Chad's jaw dropped. Brian frowned in confusion, and Greg's body stiffened as if his entire world had just tilted. "Mr. Hale," Samuel repeated, addressing the man who not only owned Crown Motors but half a dozen luxury dealerships across the West Coast. The man whose name appeared on their contracts. The man whose investments had built the empire they worked for. And suddenly, the smirks, the dismissive comments, the arrogance all shattered under the crushing weight of truth. Marcus let the silence stretch, his eyes sweeping across every guilty face, before he finally spoke. "For the past hour I was in this showroom," he said slowly, his voice calm but laced with steel. "And I experienced the worst treatment I have ever seen in any business under my name." His words were like a knife cutting through the pretense, each syllable measured and deliberate. Greg stammered. "Wait, you can't be serious. You—" But Marcus raised a hand and the room went still. "I was told I could not afford to look at a car. I was told to leave. I was treated like a criminal in my own dealership." His eyes shifted to Brian, who swallowed hard, his earlier bravado gone. Marcus continued. "And worst of all, I watched a young black professional woman walk through these doors not 20 minutes after me, and you treated her the same way. You didn't know who I was, but you showed me exactly who you are." His voice dropped to a deadly calm. "That is a failure I cannot and will not tolerate." The weight of those words settled like a storm cloud, and Samuel Price looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Realizing this disaster had unfolded under his watch, Greg tried one last time to salvage his pride, his voice weak but still defiant. "Sir, if I had known, if I had realized you were—" But Marcus cut him off, his voice sharp now, his eyes blazing. "That's exactly the problem. Respect should not depend on knowing who I am. Every customer deserves the same dignity, whether they drive a Bentley or a beat-up Civic." His words echoed through the high ceiling, customers shifting in their seats, nodding quietly, and some even pulling out phones to record what was quickly turning into a reckoning. Jessica looked pale. Chad's smirk was long gone. Brian's hands fidgeted at his sides, and Greg stood frozen, his face drained of color, sweat gathering at his temples. Marcus stepped closer to the counter, reached into his suit pocket, and pulled out a black business card, placing it softly on the marble. The sound of that card hitting the counter was louder than any shout, the letters engraved in gold. "Marcus Hale, CEO, Hale Automotive Group." Glaring back at the staff like a death sentence, gasps filled the room. A murmur ran through the customers, and the staff stood frozen, their careers unraveling in real time. Marcus's voice dropped low, calm, terrifying in its certainty. "Gregory Harlan, Chad Miller, Brian O'Connor, you're done, effective immediately." Greg's knees seemed to buckle. Chad whispered, "Please, it was a misunderstanding." And Brian stammered, "I was just following orders." But Marcus shook his head slowly. "No, you were following prejudice, and you made it company policy. Get out." His words rang final, the gavel striking down in judgment. And as Samuel Price looked on in silent horror, he knew he would spend weeks cleaning up the wreckage of this day. But in that moment, all eyes were on Marcus, the man who had been humiliated as a nobody and returned to reveal himself as the owner, the judge, and the executioner. The air was thick with silence, the staff trembling, customers whispering to one another, some even applauding quietly, because justice, when it came swiftly and without apology. Marcus had just turned humiliation into power, and the storm had only begun. The silence that followed Marcus's words was so heavy, it pressed down on every person in that marble showroom. And when he turned, his voice rising just enough to carry to every corner of the dealership, Even the customers leaned forward in their chairs, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Everyone here, listen carefully," Marcus said, his tone calm but unshakable. "Because today you will understand what it means to work under my name." Employees froze mid-step. A barista in the lounge set down a tray of cappuccinos. Mechanics peered out from the service bay. Sales staff gathered nervously near their desks, and all eyes locked on the man who had just revealed himself as Marcus Hale, the owner of Hale Automotive Group, the man whose signature sat on every paycheck. He paused, scanning the faces, letting the weight of the moment sink in. "1 month ago, I invested $45 million into this flagship store," he continued, his words deliberate, "because I believed this city, this staff, could represent the very best of our brand. Instead, in 4 weeks, you managed to generate more complaints of discrimination than any other location has in a year. That is not only shameful, it is a betrayal of everything this company was built on." A murmur swept through the employees. Shame etched on some faces, fear on others, and Marcus's eyes hardened. Respect does not depend on wealth, on race, or on appearance. It is the minimum every human being deserves when they walk through those doors. But what I saw today was arrogance, prejudice, and contempt, displayed not only toward me, but toward anyone you decided wasn't worth your time. His gaze locked on Jessica, the receptionist, who trembled visibly. Her lips parted as if to speak, but Marcus continued before she could. "I was told to go to a used lot. I was told I couldn't afford a car. I was physically pushed toward the door, and you thought nothing of it, because in your eyes I didn't look the part. Yet minutes later, a man in a tailored suit walked in, and you treated him like royalty without asking a single question. That," Marcus said firmly, his voice sharp as a blade, "is systemic discrimination, and I will not allow it." He took a deep breath, then gestured toward Samuel Price, the district manager who stood sweating by the corner, his face pale with dread. "Mr. Price," Marcus said evenly, "from this moment forward, you will prepare a full audit of this location, including every recorded customer complaint, every sales record, and every staff performance file. I want it on my desk within 72 hours. If I find one attempt to alter or erase what happened here, your resignation will be the least of your problems." Samuel nodded quickly, stammering, "Yes, sir, absolutely. I understand," his voice breaking as his career flashed before his eyes. Marcus turned back to the crowd, his eyes now falling on Greg Harlan, who stood pale and stiff, sweat running down his temple, his lips twitching as if searching for words. "Gregory Harlan, manager of this store," Marcus announced. "You are terminated effective immediately. Your arrogance, your failure to lead, and your open contempt for customers has poisoned this entire team. Take off your badge and walk out." Greg's hand shook as he unclipped his name tag, dropping it onto the counter with a faint clink that echoed like a funeral bell. And as he turned to leave, customers actually clapped quietly, their applause breaking the suffocating silence. Marcus's gaze shifted to Chad Miller, who stood hunched, the bravado drained from his smirk. "Chad Miller," Marcus said coldly, "a salesman who mocks customers, who treats dignity like a joke, who believes commission gives him power over people. You are done. Get out." Chad tried to protest, whispering, "Please, it was just..." But Marcus cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Save your excuses. They do not erase the damage you've done." Chad dropped his badge, too, his shoulders slumping as he stumbled out. Then Marcus's eyes fixed on Brian O'Connor, the security guard who had placed his hand on him, who had threatened to call the police on the very man who owned the building. "Brian," Marcus said slowly, his voice deadly calm. "You put your hands on me. You shoved me toward the door. You threatened to arrest me for standing in my own dealership. You are finished here, and when corporate security reviews this footage, They will determine whether to blacklist you permanently from ever working in one of our facilities again. Leave your badge, leave your uniform, and walk out." Brian's jaw clenched, his face red. But the authority in Marcus's tone left no room for defiance. He dropped his badge, yanked off his jacket, and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The employees left behind stood in stunned silence, their stomachs knotted, their futures uncertain. Marcus let the silence stretch, then spoke again. "For those of you still standing here, listen closely. This is not the end. It is the beginning. Starting today, this dealership will operate under new rules. Every customer, regardless of what they drive or how they dress, will be greeted with dignity. No one will be ignored. No one will be mocked. No one will be profiled. To ensure that, I am installing body-worn cameras on all floor staff. I am implementing AI monitoring of all customer interactions, and I am creating an anonymous hotline for customers to report discrimination directly to my office. If you cannot accept these rules, resign now. If you stay, you will be retrained, you will be held accountable, and you will treat every human being with respect, or you will be gone." His voice echoed against the marble walls, and employees looked at one another, some nodding silently, others pale with fear. Marcus turned toward the customers, raising his voice just enough. "And to those who witnessed what happened here today, I thank you for your patience. You will see change, not just promises. Crown Motors Los Angeles will not be remembered for its arrogance, but for how quickly it transformed into a place of fairness and dignity." The customers nodded, some applauding softly, one even recording on her phone with tears in her eyes. Marcus's expression softened slightly as he looked at Malik, who stood near the corner, his eyes wide with pride and disbelief. Malik had seen the humiliation, but now he was watching the power of justice in action, the transformation of shame into reform. Marcus looked back at his staff one final time. "This is not about punishment," he said firmly. "It is about principle. I built this company to prove that dignity belongs to everyone. If you forget that, you forget who we are. And if you forget who we are, you will not be here long." With that, he turned toward the exit, the crowd parting silently as he walked, his footsteps steady, his presence unshakable. Outside, the California sun hit the pavement, and Marcus inhaled deeply. The fury inside him cooled into resolve. He had just torn down arrogance in front of dozens of witnesses. But the work was far from over. This was only the beginning of the storm, a storm that would ripple beyond this single showroom and into every corner of his empire by the next morning. The scandal that erupted at Crown Motors Los Angeles had already reached every corner of the automotive industry. And Marcus Hale, sitting at the head of a long mahogany table in his downtown office, was staring at a room full of executives who knew their futures now depended on what he would do next. His voice calm but sharp as steel. "What happened yesterday wasn't just an embarrassment for this store. It was a failure for the entire company. And every one of you sitting here is responsible for making sure it never happens again." The executives shifted nervously in their seats, their polished laptops open, notes scattered across the table. But Marcus's eyes were unyielding as he leaned forward. "We are not going to patch this up with a press release, or sweep it under the rug with a quiet firing. This is going to be a reckoning." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed screenshots of social media posts that had already gone viral. A clip of Greg shouting, "Get out now, you're not welcome here," had been shared 3 million times overnight. Hashtags like Crown Motors discrimination and justice for customers were trending across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and the company's stock had dipped 7% in pre-market trading. Marcus pointed at the papers, his tone unwavering. "This is what prejudice costs. Millions in reputation, billions in trust, and years of brand equity destroyed in minutes." He paused, letting his words sink in. then announced the plan that would reshape the company from top to bottom. Starting immediately, every dealership under Hale Automotive Group will undergo a 30-day audit of all customer interactions, every complaint, every secret shopper report, every security log. I want full transparency, no exceptions. If anyone tries to hide or falsify records, they will be terminated and blacklisted from the industry. Next, I'm establishing what I'm calling the Integrity Protocol. This is not optional. Every sales associate, receptionist, and security guard will wear body cams during working hours. AI analysis will monitor tone, body language, and language patterns for bias. Customers will have a direct line to my office through an app where they can submit reviews and footage instantly. And more importantly, Marcus's voice tightened, his finger pressing against the table. Respect will no longer be a guideline. It will be a condition of employment. The room fell silent, the executives exchanging uneasy glances, but none dared argue. One executive cleared his throat, asking carefully, "Marcus, the cost, this system will run into tens of millions." Marcus turned to him with eyes that cut like glass. "Do you think the cost of dignity is higher than the cost of losing everything? Because if you do, you're sitting at the wrong table." No one spoke again. Marcus continued, "To make sure these reforms are real, I'm creating a new division, Customer Equity and Justice, led by an independent board of community leaders, not just corporate suits. They will have authority to audit stores, interview customers, and fire managers directly without my approval. That's how serious I am." Gasps rippled through the room. Never before had an automotive group given outside voices such power over internal operations. But Marcus didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, his tone steady. "Because if I don't build a culture of accountability, then I am no better than the men I fired yesterday." Later that afternoon, Marcus stood before a row of cameras at a press conference, the Crown Motors logo shining behind him, reporters leaning forward with microphones, the air buzzing with anticipation. He didn't hide. He didn't dodge questions. Instead, he walked straight to the podium and told America exactly what happened. "Yesterday, I walked into my own dealership disguised as an ordinary customer, and I was humiliated, ignored, and thrown out because of the way I looked. What my employees didn't know was that I am Marcus Hale, founder and CEO of Hale Automotive Group. What they revealed was not only disrespect toward me, but toward every customer who doesn't fit their idea of what wealth looks like. That ends today." His words echoed, his voice carrying the weight of righteous fury. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and the press conference streamed live across national networks. "I have terminated those responsible, but firings alone won't solve this," Marcus declared, his hand raised for emphasis. "So today, I am launching a $50 million reform initiative across all dealerships. Every employee will undergo mandatory equity and dignity training. Every store will be audited, and every customer will be treated with the respect they deserve, whether they drive up in a Bentley or a beat-up Honda. And if anyone doubts my resolve, remember this. Yesterday I was escorted out of my own dealership, and today I am escorting prejudice out of my company." The applause that followed wasn't just from the crowd of employees standing behind him. It was from ordinary people watching live streams, clapping in their living rooms, sharing the video online with captions like, "This is leadership," and, "Finally, accountability." Meanwhile, the fired employees, Greg, Chad, Brian, and Jessica, faced their own fallout. Greg found his name splashed across headlines, his arrogant outburst immortalized in a viral clip. No dealership in Los Angeles would hire him, and his LinkedIn inbox was flooded not with job offers, but with angry messages condemning his behavior. Chad's real estate license, which he held on the side, was suspended after regulators reviewed footage of his discriminatory remarks, citing conduct unbecoming of a licensed agent. Jessica's name spread across social media as a cautionary tale. Her condescending "honey" Maybe try the used lot quote turned into memes. Destroying her chances at ever working in luxury retail again. Brian, the security guard, was investigated by the state licensing board for misuse of authority, and within weeks his license was revoked, ending his career in security permanently. The consequences were swift, brutal, and undeniable. But Marcus wasn't interested in revenge. He was focused on transformation. In the weeks that followed, Hale Automotive Group became a national story. News anchors praised the bold reforms, advocacy groups applauded the integrity protocol, and civil rights leaders hailed Marcus as a pioneer for corporate accountability. Customers flocked to Crown Motors not out of scandal, but out of respect, eager to support a business that had chosen transparency over denial. Sales rebounded, stock prices stabilized, and within 3 months the company had regained everything it lost and more. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with just repairing his empire. He knew prejudice was not a one-day problem, it was a generational problem, and he was determined to leave a legacy that reached beyond cars and dealerships. At a follow-up board meeting, he announced a new scholarship fund, the Hale Dignity Fund, committing $10 million annually to support students from underprivileged communities pursuing business, law, and engineering. Because if we want dignity in business tomorrow, Marcus said, his voice heavy with conviction, we must educate leaders today who know the value of respect. The executives nodded, humbled, inspired, aware they were part of something far bigger than quarterly reports. And as Marcus walked out of that boardroom, his assistant Malik at his side, he felt the weight of responsibility, but also the fire of purpose. He had taken a moment of humiliation and turned it into a movement, one that would ripple through industries and inspire leaders everywhere. The story of what happened at Crown Motors didn't just stay in Los Angeles, it exploded across the entire nation. And by the second week, Marcus Hale found himself not only in the headlines of every major paper, but invited to testify before Congress on corporate discrimination and consumer protection. A position he never asked for, but one he refused to walk away from because he knew the stakes were bigger than him or his company. They were about the dignity of every American customer who had ever been looked down on in Washington, under the bright lights of the congressional hearing room. Marcus sat in a crisp navy suit, his posture steady, his eyes calm, as lawmakers peppered him with questions about what reforms were truly possible. Some politicians treated him like a visionary, others like a businessman on a public relations tour. But Marcus didn't waver. His opening statement silenced the room. I wasn't humiliated because I couldn't afford a car. I was humiliated because my employees judged me by my skin, my clothes, and my car keys. That humiliation is happening to ordinary people every day, in dealerships, in banks, in hotels. I have the power to fight back, but most Americans don't. That is why I'm here today. The cameras clicked, pens scratched across notepads, and even skeptical congressmen leaned forward. Marcus laid out his integrity protocol, explaining how body cams, AI monitoring, and direct customer feedback loops had already slashed complaints at his dealerships by 60% in the first month. He described how transparency, not secrecy, restored trust, and how accountability wasn't an option, but a necessity. Civil rights leaders seated behind him nodded, knowing this testimony was more than words. It was a blueprint. Outside the chamber, protesters carried signs reading, "Respect is not optional," and "End consumer discrimination now," chanting Marcus's name as though he were a movement, not just a CEO, and in living rooms across America. Older viewers watching C-SPAN or CNN whispered to each other, "This man is speaking the truth we've all known but never seen fixed." The firestorm wasn't just political, it was cultural. Talk shows debated the story. Radio hosts replayed Greg's infamous line, "Get out now, you're not welcome here." and ordinary people called in to share their own stories of being treated like second-class citizens in stores, dealerships, and offices. Marcus listened quietly to those voices at night, scrolling through messages from strangers who thanked him for standing up, realizing the issue was far deeper than he had first imagined. Meanwhile, consequences rippled out further for the fired employees. Greg's name appeared in industry blacklists, his face recognized whenever he applied for a new job, forcing him into a spiral of unemployment and bitterness. Jessica tried to sue for wrongful termination, but her case collapsed the moment the video clips of her words were replayed in court. Leaving her saddled with legal fees and a ruined reputation, Brian the guard, stripped of his license, took to social media to claim he was just following orders. But the public didn't buy it, and his posts were flooded with comments reminding him that decency isn't optional. Chad's fall was equally harsh, his real estate career evaporating as clients abandoned him, his name now synonymous with arrogance for Marcus. However, the goal wasn't their downfall, it was building something new. That's why, even as the hearings ended and the press continued to chase him, he doubled down on reforms. He announced the Hale Customer Bill of Rights, a bold set of guarantees plastered across every dealership wall. Every customer deserves acknowledgement within 2 minutes of entering. No one will ever be asked for proof of finances before viewing a vehicle. And any employee who disrespects a customer can be reported instantly and investigated within 24 hours. To many, it sounded revolutionary. But to Marcus, it was just common sense. His sincerity turned critics into reluctant allies, and soon other industries started paying attention. Hotel chains called asking about his AI monitoring system, banks requested briefings on his training model, and even Congress drafted new consumer protection legislation inspired by his testimony. Yet Marcus knew the battle wasn't won. Prejudice couldn't be erased with one press conference or one law. But he also knew that change had begun, and momentum was on his side. That night, back in Los Angeles, Marcus sat alone in his office, staring at the skyline, reflecting on the path from humiliation to reform. He thought about his father, who had once been told at a car lot in Atlanta that people like you don't belong here, and realized this fight was personal, not just for him, but for every generation that came before. He thought about customers like Jennifer, who had been brushed aside in that showroom, and promised himself that the days of silent discrimination in his dealerships were over. The story of Crown Motors had started as a scandal, but now it was becoming something far greater, a catalyst for national change. And as Marcus leaned back, exhausted but resolute, he whispered to himself words that carried both relief and determination. This isn't just about cars anymore. This is about who we are as a country. 6 months later, the story of Crown Motors had transformed from scandal into legend. And Marcus Hale, once humiliated in his own dealership, now stood at the center of a movement that had reshaped the automotive industry and sparked conversations across boardrooms nationwide. His reforms no longer seen as radical, but as the new standard of business integrity. Sales across Hale Automotive Group had soared, not because of flashy ads or celebrity endorsements, but because ordinary people felt safe walking into his showrooms, knowing they would be treated with dignity whether they wore a suit or overalls, whether they drove a Bentley or a battered Civic. The integrity protocol had expanded beyond dealerships. Hotel chains, banks, and even airlines were adopting similar body cam and AI monitoring programs, all citing Hale Automotive as the model. But Marcus wasn't chasing praise. He was chasing permanence. On a warm summer afternoon, he returned to the very same Los Angeles dealership where everything had erupted, not as a disguised customer this time, but as the CEO, surrounded by employees, community leaders, and local media. The walls now bore a new sign, bold and impossible to miss. Every customer, every time. Respect is the price of entry. As Marcus addressed the crowd, his voice steady, his presence commanding, he spoke not only of cars but of character. "What happened here 6 months ago could have destroyed us," he said, pausing as the crowd hung on every word. "But instead, it became the reason we are stronger than ever. We learned that respect is not optional. It is the foundation. We learned that accountability is not punishment. It is protection. And we learned that the greatest test of leadership is what you do when everything is on the line." Applause filled the showroom, but Marcus lifted his hand, signaling there was more. He turned to introduce Jennifer Collins, the young professional who had been brushed aside that fateful day. Standing tall in a sharp navy suit, Jennifer now served as the first director of customer equity and justice at Hale Automotive, overseeing every complaint and leading a new generation of managers trained to listen first. Judge never. Her smile reflected both pride and vindication as Marcus said, "Jennifer represents the future of this company, a future built on fairness." Tears welled in Jennifer's eyes as she nodded, acknowledging how far she had come from being humiliated in the same room to leading its reform. Meanwhile, the former antagonists faced very different fates. Greg, the arrogant manager, had vanished from the industry, his name forever tied to disgrace. Jessica, the receptionist, tried to rebuild her life in small retail jobs but struggled under the shadow of viral infamy. Brian, the guard, found work as a night janitor after losing his license, often telling co-workers he wished he had spoken up instead of obeying blindly. Chad drifted into obscurity, his real estate dreams shattered. Their downfalls became cautionary tales told in staff meetings across industries, examples of how arrogance and prejudice could end careers in a heartbeat. Yet Marcus didn't gloat. He reminded his staff that their ruin was not the point. The point was to prevent the next Greg, the next Jessica, the next Brian from ever existing inside his walls. That was why he invested not only in audits and training, but in people, launching the Hale Dignity Scholarship, which by its first cycle had already awarded 50 students from underserved communities the chance to study business, law, or engineering. "Because dignity isn't just a policy," Marcus said at the scholarship gala, his voice breaking slightly. "It's an inheritance we pass on to the next generation." The crowd of donors and students rose to their feet, clapping, some crying, as Marcus stood tall with his wife by his side, knowing his mission had expanded far beyond car sales. By the close of the year, Hale Automotive wasn't just a company, it was a symbol. Customers across the country wore pins that read, "I was heard," a campaign born from Marcus's reforms. Legislators introduced the Hale Consumer Fairness Act, inspired directly by his congressional testimony, setting nationwide standards for transparency and equity in retail. Newspapers hailed him as the man who turned humiliation into hope, and late-night hosts replayed his calm words. "Your respect shouldn't depend on knowing who I am," calling them some of the truest ever spoken in corporate America. And yet, for Marcus, the defining moment came quietly one evening, when he walked back into that dealership alone. No cameras, no reporters, just him standing in the same marble-floored showroom where Greg once screamed for him to leave. This time, a young salesman approached with a smile and said, "Good evening, sir. Can I help you find something today?" No hesitation, no judgment, no dismissal. Marcus smiled back, shaking the young man's hand, feeling the weight of everything that had changed. He realized then that the battle wasn't over. Prejudice would never disappear entirely, but the culture had shifted. The standard had been set, and the proof was in that simple, genuine greeting. He turned to leave, whispering to himself words meant not for the company, not for the press, but for his father, who had once been told at a dealership decades ago that he didn't belong. We belong now. Dad, we always did. And with that, Marcus Hale stepped into the night, not as a man who had been humiliated, but as a leader who had built a legacy of respect that would outlive him. Thank you for watching this story to the very end. If it moved you, if it made you think, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter.